in Geneva, Switzerland today, where I'm rehearsing a bunch of my pieces and also doing some lecturing. So I happen to be in a hotel that has a very nice rooftop patio, so I thought that I might try answering some viewer questions from here. I have no idea if this is going to work or not, but we'll give it a try, and if you're watching this, then that probably means it has worked. So I put out a post on YouTube a couple of weeks ago just asking for questions from viewers, and in response I got about 60 questions in from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, various other places. And I was sort of struck by how high the quality was of many of these questions. I can't answer all of them, unfortunately, because that would just result in a crazily long video, but I selected about a third of them, so I'm just going to do my best to answer them succinctly. So this is going to be a bit of a marathon in terms of questions. We'll see how this goes. So, okay, and I'm going to try to do this without any edits also, so this will be my unscripted and spontaneous reactions to these questions. Okay, so what's the first question? So Diego Coes writes, is there any genre of music that you can't stand? Well, no, because I don't actually think in terms of genres of music. It's not a category, or a type of categorization that I find particularly useful. The other thing is that often when people talk about genres of music, they're actually confusing genre and style, and it's not really the same thing. So a genre for me would be something like symphonic music or opera or popular music, for example, and all of its sort of subgenres. But a style would probably be something a little bit more specific. But in any case, whether you're talking about a genre or a style, no, there are no sort of off-limits categories for me. I would say that there is good and bad music in all styles. I would also say that, you know, it strikes me that sort of discounting an entire category of music because of its style is a little bit like discounting an entire category of person, which, you know, either way you look at it is probably not the best way to go about things. So, no, I try to maintain an open mind. I listen to a very wide variety of different sorts of things, and I try to remain open to the possibility that there could be something original, something striking, something I've never heard before, something valuable to be found in them. So what's my next question here? Noah writes, how did you go about developing your personal style? How do you describe that style, if possible? I don't know, urban chic? Okay, I think you're talking about my music. Well, basically the way I came to my style, to the extent that I have one, is by listening very carefully and, well, not only to all sorts of other things, but also listening very carefully to my own music and sort of being ruthlessly critical. So a lot of that had to do with clearing out dead wood. So in other words, being completely merciless about determining whether something was something in my music, you know, a stylistic tick of some kind, or a technique or a way of proceeding, was something that actually was a useful means to an end, like a musical end of some kind, or just something that was a form of abstract speculation that didn't really lead anywhere, or that didn't bear any particular fruit, acoustically speaking or emotionally speaking, or just in terms of the expressive impact of the work. So it's very easy, especially when you're a young composer and you're sort of working out how to compose, to sort of fill your scores with what I would call junk information and sort of junk structures. In other words, things that how do I put it? Things that in your mind have a certain reality, but that absolutely do not translate to any possible acoustic reality. Like, so that could be, for example, pitch structures that are perfectly inaudible. Like, and that doesn't mean they have to be directly audible, but they have to sort of help you to arrive at a particular surface quality that you're aiming at for musical reasons. And if the sort of pitch structuring that you're using doesn't do that, or you could achieve that means through some other simpler manner, then you should probably choose the simpler solution. So anyway, a lot of it has to do with just a very, very ruthless and ongoing process of being, you know, completely merciless in terms of, you know, what do I need to get rid of in my music. So like the way I arrived at a style was more through elimination than anything else. It's like, you know, the famous joke about how do you how do you make a sculpture of an elephant? It's like you take a block of marble and you chip away everything that doesn't look like an elephant. So it's like it's the same thing in music. You chip away everything that doesn't, in some very deep way, resonate with you and that doesn't seem to be authentically yours. And there's no shortcut to that. It takes a really long time. It especially takes a long time these days, given the fact that every composer basically has the task of establishing their own stylistic approach, whereas 100 years ago that wasn't the case. I mean, there was a much narrower range of styles that were being practiced, and a composer who went through a conservatory or some kind of apprenticeship would just, as a matter of course, be expected to master these sort of technical tools that are associated with that style. These days, the training is much more open in some ways, and composers are kind of left to their own devices. And once you sort of start to get a career going, you kind of have to define the stylistic parameters of your music yourself, and that does make it a lot more complicated. It's also one of the reasons, incidentally, why contemporary composers seem to produce quite a lot fewer works than was the case, for example, in the Baroque period, where you had composers like Vivaldi just churning out hundreds of concertos, and Haydn with his 104 symphonies and this sort of thing. It's like there's a few people who do that today. There's a Scandinavian composer by the name of Leif Segerstam who's written something like 100 symphonies. But that's a relatively eccentric position to take, and most composers who are commissioned to write pieces for ensembles and orchestras and so on, the average, as far as I can tell, seems to be maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 pieces a year for most composers, and some people write quite a lot less than that. So anyway, so the task has gotten slower and probably more complicated and more difficult for composers today. So next question. Rocco Hale writes, what's your experience with synthesizers and electronic music? As far as synthesizers go, I like analog synthesizers quite a lot for a number of reasons. One of them is that they're not perfect, so they have interesting defects that are sort of unpredictable and that result in a kind of a organic quality. If you listen to the album Rock Bottom by Robert Wyatt, which I would certainly recommend everyone to do, he uses electronic sounds on that album that are really interesting, because I think he mentioned that he found some old sort of slightly malfunctioning Italian keyboard somewhere, and it had a very peculiar resonance and it didn't sort of work exactly the way it was supposed to, and he just loved that quality because it was unpredictable, and so that was something that really colored that particular album. So I like synthesizers when there's a kind of, I can't think of another way to put this, an instrument quality to them. In other words, they're not just sort of perfectly functioning machines, but they have something about them that is limited, that is flawed, that you have to adapt to. You have to sort of learn to, work your way around them. So when I have used electronic keyboards in my work, it's always been these cheap toys, things like the Casio keyboards, for example, that I'm really affectionate for, because they're very limited. And in order to do something musical with them, you can't just sort of turn them on and have them arpeggiate something and then put it through a filter and have something that sounds half decent. You actually have to be quite creative in your thinking in order to find a way to use them that is musically interesting, and that sort of allows you to transcend the inherent limitations of the object itself. And that's when it becomes an instrument. Like, an instrument for me is something that is limited. It's not something that will do anything you command it to with perfect precision every time. That for me is sort of what a robot is. It's not quite the same thing. And I suppose that you could say that has its own area of aesthetic interest, but it's not mine. So I like these things that are they're basically machines, but they're not perfect. And as far as sort of the broader question of electronic music goes, yeah, I studied at IRCAM in Paris for a year. IRCAM is an institute devoted to electroacoustic music and all the various things you can do with machines. And it was interesting and enriching in terms of just sort of taking that sort of degree of microscopic attention to sound and understanding sound from a more physical perspective than perhaps I had done previously. And I'm sure that that's affected my approach to orchestration also, because I'm very, very attentive to things like the different harmonic spectra of different instruments and what happens when you combine them together. And, just thinking more generally in terms of the sound characteristics of of instruments in particular registers, and how rich or poor or complex or sort of regular or pristine their harmonic spectra are. And stuff like that, I'm sure, came about from studying electroacoustics. But I don't particularly enjoy the medium itself. I don't actually like computers all that much, and I prefer that their presence in my life be rather invisible. So I certainly don't fantasize about living in an underground room and staring in front of a computer screen for like 12 hours a day, which kind of, I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but if you really want to do electronic music properly and master the tools and do interesting and compelling and original work, then you're going to be dealing with computers a lot. And it's also something, it's very difficult to, you can't really dabble in electronic music. It's like, if you're going to do it and do a good job, then you're going to have to be prepared to spend, many, many, many hours a day on that. And that precludes all sorts of other things. So it's probably just a question of an admission that I can't do everything. There are certain areas that I'm more interested in than others, and that's what I'm choosing to focus on. And in my case, that happens to be mostly instrumental composition, although I also do write vocal pieces. Okay, so Joey Kastelik writes, do you think music can be objectively good? If music is perceived so subjectively, how can we judge it by objective standards? I don't think that that's necessarily the right way to look at it. I think that you need to approach music more pragmatically and heuristically than scientifically in many cases. So in other words, you have to look at it in terms of does it do what it's setting out to do? Does it do what it's setting out to do optimally? Is it doing it in such a way that is powerful and rich and complex? Is it possible to go back to the piece multiple times and listen to it and find different facets of it each time? That for me is an important question, actually, because, I mean, the world is full of music that you can hear once or twice and you get a certain charge out of it and then it's over. It's sort of depleted itself, and you can return to it, but you're not going to get anything more out of it. Like probably the most extreme example of that would be elevator music. It's like it has a particular function, and it serves that function for the 25 seconds that you're in the elevator, and then when you're out of it, you never want to hear that piece again. You just, that's it. The function's been exhausted in 25 seconds. That's an extreme example, but there's all kinds of commercial music that operates more or less on those same lines too, where one or two hearings is plenty. So, but if we're talking about the realm of art music, then I think a basic criteria would be that you would have to be able to listen to it multiple times without the piece exhausting itself immediately. So, and that means you need to have multiple layers of meaning embedded in the piece. So, in other words, you have to have a level of immediate seduction. So that means you hear the piece for the first time, maybe you're distracted, maybe you're confused, but there's still something on the level of an immediate seduction. So there's something about the orchestration that's striking, there's a melodic line that's memorable, there's something dramatic in it that sort of gets your attention. So even if you're sort of listening casually or you're not necessarily familiar with the style of that composer, the idea is there should be something in the piece that you can find compelling on a first listen that would make you want to listen again. So if you're listening to it and you don't have that level of seduction and you're just sort of bored and the piece sort of is just sort of grating on your nerves, like you're just never going to want to listen to it again. So I think no matter what the style is, it doesn't matter if it's a piece of avant-garde composition or a classical piece or a piece of commercial music, there has to be something embedded in the surface level that makes you want to listen to it a second time. So once you get beyond that, if you want to listen to it again, then the next step would be having sufficient depth in the composition so that a second hearing will result in more meaning and more sort of what would you say? You get more out of it the second time. That's it, and you can keep on listening to it. And the very, very great works of music have this bizarre quality of being seemingly inexhaustible. It's like you could listen to them 100 times, 200 times, and each time you would be hearing them differently, and you would be sort of your understanding of that piece would be changing and evolving. And that's the sign of a really great work as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so Michael Slovan writes, who are some classical composers you believe to be unfairly maligned in major critical and academic circles? How does one most effectively counteract negative consensus on a composer? As far as classical composers go, I mean, there are very few, actually, where you can say that there is a negative consensus. You can say, however, there are certainly historical figures who are neglected, and that's a different thing. So in a certain sense, negative consensus on a composer tends to be equivalent to neglect. It's like, okay, the work of this particular musician is not interesting enough, or it's not of a high enough standard, or there's other people who did the same thing better in that same style. So therefore, we're just going to pass over that particular figure and go on to this other one who did it better. So, I mean, that's sort of what a negative consensus consists of. It's not like people write books talking about how much they dislike this or that composer. Like, it doesn't usually happen, generally speaking. You're better off sort of spending time with things that you like. That being said, there are composers who, I think for one reason or another, probably don't get the attention they deserve. That's true of all kinds of musicians, that's for sure. And part of the reason for that, it's not, you used the word unfair in your question, but you have to wonder, is it in fact unfair? Like, if we think about the number of people over the past, let's say, 700 years who have written music, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of pieces, maybe millions of pieces, by tens of thousands of composers, you know, just to throw out a number. You only have so much time. You can't spend your time listening to every single insignificant piece of every composer who ever lived. It's like, it's impossible. Even if you wanted to, you wouldn't be able to. And why would you want to in the first place? Because there's lots of other things to do in life. So I think part of it is just that for one reason or another, there are composers that connect with a particular zeitgeist better than others. There are composers whose work maybe reflects the interest of the current age more than others. That doesn't mean that the composers who temporarily are out of favor are not as good or not as interesting necessarily. It just means that they don't really connect with a particular with the current cultural moment. But that doesn't mean that can't change. I mean, there's all kinds of examples in music history of composers who were in favor, you know, very, very popular for a certain amount of time, and then, you know, when they died, their music was completely forgotten for 200 years. And Vivaldi's a good example of that. Another one is Paul Hindemith, and I just made a video about him, actually. So if anyone's interested in this question, then you might want to check out that video, because he's a really interesting example, because in his lifetime, particularly sort of in the second half of his life, like Paul Hindemith was sort of the equivalent of a compositional rock star. Like when the Mathis Darmaler Symphony was first performed, I think it had over 100 performances or something crazy like this in the first year alone. It's like of an orchestral piece. Like, how many composers today can claim to have had 100 performances within a year of a new orchestral work? It's like it basically doesn't happen. So he had a level of success and of sort of public recognition that was extremely high in his lifetime, but he was also thought of as being a kind of sort of an unpleasant personality, kind of very dry, dour, and he had sort of a reputation as being a very sort of strict teacher who tended to push his students towards writing in the same style as him. And unfortunately, that had a number of negative effects, and it really tarnished his reputation. And you could say that to some degree, I mean, his music very sort of suddenly fell out of favor after the 1960s, like in a major way. And it would probably be safe to say that he is catastrophically unfashionable today. But nevertheless, there's some good music in his catalog. So, yeah, I mean, you know, just having a certain amount of curiosity to sort of look into some of the more obscure corners of the repertoire will put you in contact with all sorts of things that are, you know, quite interesting and that you might not hear about otherwise. So, okay, so next question. So Pretzel722, okay, I really like these YouTube avatar names. This is really something. So Pretzel722 writes, it's like, was Pretzel721 already taken? It's like, okay. When studying new areas in music, how do you discern between useful and useless content? For example, I expanded my chord voicing vocabulary considerably last year, but I found that a lot of the voicings I learnt are barely, if ever, usable outside of extremely specific contexts. It seems I wasted a lot of time for a little game. Well, it seems that way, but the thing is, like, when you're learning an art like composition, it's very unlikely that if you sit down to work out a technical problem and do it seriously, that time will be wasted, even if you end up not using that particular technique or not necessarily needing to address that problem again. Probably that effort will be useful, because first of all, it's like if you hadn't worked that problem out, you would be frustrated and you would be sort of conscious of having not gone as far as you could have, and that's not always a good thing. And secondly, don't assume that just because you're not using that chord progression or whatever it is, or this rhythmic idea, or this or that way of treating musical discourse now, that you won't need to in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. You have to take a long view of things. Like Elliott Carter in the 1960s, in the entire 1960s, wrote like 3 pieces. So his average amount of time that he would spend on pieces at that time was 5 years. So we're talking like the double concerto, and the piano concerto, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, he wasn't in a hurry, and he made some extraordinarily interesting discoveries through that process. A lot of it, like if you look at the sketches for these pieces, there are in some cases thousands, literally thousands of pages of sketches. The vast majority of which did not find their way into the pieces. But it's like he had to swim through all of this stuff in order to get to the gold, really. It's like you're sifting through a pile of rubbish to get to the one little grain of the one diamond in the rubbish heap that is going to make the difference between an okay piece and a really great piece. There's no way around that. You have to. It's prospecting is what it is basically, and you have to do it. So. Robert Trevisani writes, how did your love for Western concert music begin and then develop? Which pieces and composers initially stood out to you? And has your appreciation of this music grown in a constantly additive manner, or have you found yourself growing less fond of certain music as your knowledge and appreciation develops? Okay, well, the things that struck me first were things that were relatively short. So I remember when I was, maybe 15 or 16 years old, my father had a great collection of LPs, and he had a number of albums of Georg Schulte conducting Mahler symphonies. Those are great recordings, by the way. But I couldn't get into them, partly because, most of those pieces are 90 minutes long. Maybe my attention span wasn't particularly long when I was 15, I don't know. It was a lot to start with, like a 90-minute long symphony. So I tended to gravitate towards things that were shorter. And actually one of those was Beethoven's 8th Symphony, which I had in an LP by Eugene Ormandy. Just an amazing recording. I love Ormandy's Beethoven recordings. And it's like, I love that piece. There's not a single note wasted. Not that Beethoven ever wastes notes, but he's particularly economical in the 8th Symphony. It's short, it's compact, it's humorous. There's no slow movement. It has a sort of a quick pace to it. It's entertaining, it's fun to listen to. And I listened to that piece over and over and over again. And then it's like, once you get a taste for stuff like that, then if you're curious enough and you want to keep going, then you can get into pieces that are longer, that are more complex. Actually, I shouldn't say more complex. The 8th Symphony is quite a complex piece, but let's say that are longer or that take more patience to listen to. So that's sort of how it went for me. As far as areas of repertoire that I have less regard for now than I used to, yeah, there's a few. I mean, there's definitely composers that I spent a lot of time listening to before I turned 20 that are very little interest to me now, but. That's how it goes. I'm sure that's how it goes for everybody. It's like your tastes change, your degree of appreciation changes, and there might be something that you find very striking at a certain point, but it's like, this connects to one of the questions I answered earlier. It's like at a certain point, you sort of realize that you've exhausted it. It's like maybe that particular work was good for 10 hearings, and there's nothing more else to get out of it, and then you move on. So, fair enough. So Neomorphos Alomorphos writes, how much money does a composer earn per month? How did this situation change in time over the last 20 years? And space, rights management in different countries, amount per work. If it changed, did it change your practice / every composer's practices? Okay, well, I can't comment on every composer's practices, just like I sort of can't comment on the listening habits of the average person, because it turns out the average person doesn't exist. But anyway, how much, well, how do I answer this? Different composers earn different amounts of money depending on how successful they are, and also depending on what it is they're trying to do. So there are composers whose goal is to make a living as a composer, and there are composers whose goal is to write music, but not necessarily to make a living out of it. So, and I've seen lots of examples of this. Many of my colleagues, when I was in school, were aiming at getting a teaching job so that they could earn a living, and then the composing would be something they would fit in when they could. My goal was to be a composer primarily, and then if I was able to find something else that would result in some kind of a stable income without getting in the way of my primary goal, which was writing music, then that would be great. That resulted in things being a little bit harder for me for a while, that's for sure. But the upside of it is that most of my time has actually been devoted to composition in either a direct or an indirect way. So the other thing to think about this is that what constitutes spending time on composition. So maybe I spend a lot of time obviously making YouTube videos and lecturing and traveling and stuff like that. You could say, well, that's not really composing, but it actually feeds into my composing, because when I answer questions from viewers, for example, or when I make a video on a particular work or a particular composer, I'm having to reflect on those subjects, and then my reflections then will stimulate ideas in my creative work. So it's all connected as far as I'm concerned. So that counts as time devoted to the art of composition. It's not as though only the time that I'm sitting down at my desk, holding a pencil and writing some notes down on a piece of paper. Like, that's the only time that I would count to be time spent on music. So anyway, yeah. So, but there's all kinds of people that have multiple revenue streams that allow them to survive as a musician. It can be teaching, it can be royalties, it can be all sorts of things. If you're interested in hearing more about this in detail, I do have a video actually called something like how can composers make a living? I can't remember the exact title, but anyway, you can watch that video if you're interested. So, Joshua Hendel writes, what are the limits of what music can communicate? Is there a delineated sphere of the properly musical outside of which instrumental music cannot communicate or transmit meanings? How has music evolved or attempted to communicate different types of meanings over its history and into today? There are lots of contemporary composers that are inspired by things like architecture, quantum mechanics, literature, painting, Turkish rugs, all sorts of things, and that's fine. It's like if that stimulates your creativity, if that makes you think about musical problems in a different way, then that's completely fine. Where it gets problematic for me is when you have musicians who are taking what is essentially a literary idea, or essentially a poetic idea, or a philosophical idea, and trying to translate it into the musical medium. Gérard Griset, the French composer, who sort of was one of the main initiators of the so-called spectralist movement, was very interesting in this regards, because he put out more or less a manifesto in which he said, we are musicians, we're not writers, we're not philosophers, we're not architects. This is what our medium is. Our medium is sound, and I think that's actually a very interesting approach to take. I actually agree with it for the most part. That's not to say that you can't allude to other things, and obviously everything that you experience and that you take in and everything that's a part of the particular cultural moment that you're in is going to affect you and is going to, in some way, impact your music. But I don't know that it's necessarily the right approach to try to take something that is essentially a visual phenomenon or a literary phenomenon or a plastic phenomenon of some kind and translate it into music. That just doesn't work very well as far as I'm concerned. So that's what I would say about that. As far as the properly musical is sound, movement, and time. That's it. Okay, next question. Perhaps this has already been answered before, but how does one go about analyzing a piece by a contemporary composer who doesn't happen to belong to any particular school of compositional philosophy or style? For example, I've been trying to analyze Threnody to Toki for strings and piano by Takashi Yoshimatsu for like 15 years now. The liner notes to the score say that it is serialist, but I cannot really find how it is all organized, especially with regards to rhythm and pitch organization. Also, analyzing composers like Takemitsu also proves to be difficult. by the way, his homage to Feldman, Twill by Twilight, is absolutely amazing. Okay, so you can certainly put yourself in a world of pain if you attempt to analyze composers using analytical tools that are not appropriate to their style. That's for sure. So I would say, think about what the composer is trying to do first. Try to understand their aesthetic world. Try to understand where they're coming from and what it is that they're trying to, what their expressive aims are, basically. And then you can sort of try to think about what is the appropriate analytical tool to elucidate how the composer went about doing their work. So if you're looking at a piece like some of the early Penderecki scores, for example, and you're trying to take a Schenkerian approach, this is a deliberately absurd example, obviously that's not going to yield very much. So, you know, if you're looking at a piece by Ligeti or Penderecki or Xenakis, then you're probably going to want to have different categories of analytical approach. So, for example, you might want to look at things like instrumental texture. You know, you're going to have to think about what is the function of texture in this piece, what are the different categories of texture or of sound object that the composer is exploiting, how might I categorize them, can I come up with some kind of a taxonomy of different sound objects that are being exploited in this work, how do they evolve across time, that sort of thing. You know, there are all kinds of cases where it's simply not appropriate or interesting or fruitful to take a pitch-based analytical approach to a particular piece. So if your analysis method is yielding nothing but frustration and is not allowing you to understand the piece better, then it could be a sign that you don't have enough sort of analytical tools in your toolbox, so to speak, but it could also be a sign that you're just looking at it the wrong way. You know, you're looking at it in a way that isn't particularly fruitful or interesting. So so I would say, you know, take a radically different approach to looking at the piece and see if that helps. More broadly, I would say, you know, reading analytical articles can be quite helpful, reading a broad range of different things just to get a sense of how different analysts approach music. A lot of these are hard to find, unfortunately. Like, there's all kinds of, you know, really great analytical articles that you can only find on academic websites like JSTOR, and it's expensive to get a membership there. But if you're a university student, then you probably have access to JSTOR for free, things like that, or you have access to a library where you can look up old you know, reviews of musicology or music analysis. And I would just sort of familiarize yourself with that world and read a bunch of things and go from there. So let's have a look at the next question. So Artem Lukyanov writes, since you mentioned you are interested in electronic music, are you familiar with such musicians as Aphex Twin, Autechre, Square Pusher, and others from the IDM/braindance/experimental scene? Would love to hear your analysis on some individual tracks, if not the whole albums. Yeah, I'm familiar with that stuff, for sure, yeah. I had friends when I was a teenager who were very enthusiastic about that music and you know, lent me CDs and cassettes and stuff like that. Besides Aphex Twin and Autechre, I listened to things like Oval and Plastic Man. I mean, I remember actually... Oh, and there's another one, Zoviet France was a good one. There's this really strange collective that did just the most alien, otherworldly things. I was really impressed with those, and they sort of connected with my interest in sort of just unusual forms of aesthetic expression generally. So yeah, I've heard that stuff. It's not always appropriate to analyze it, though. You know, what is the goal of analysis? Like, why would you want to analyze something in the first place? It's to try to get a better sense of how it was put together and how some of the decisions that were made in the making of it made it as powerful or as rich or as complex or as interesting as it is. And it allows you to connect with that particular work perhaps more intensively and to just have a deeper appreciation of it. But that being said, there are some types of music that don't yield very much to analytical methods. It's like they're not really put together that way. They might be put together in a very intuitive manner that doesn't really involve necessarily a lot of carefully considered choices. It might be just very spontaneous. It's like, how do you analyze something that's done really spontaneously? You know, and is that necessarily the best approach to take? So I wouldn't actually, and I'm not saying that things like Autechre, for example, are put together spontaneously, because I know there's a lot of craft and care that goes into those. But there are some things that, and it's not because I don't find them interesting or I don't enjoy them, but there are some things that I'm just not particularly interested in analyzing. Like, you know, I was extremely interested, like to the point of obsession with things like Sid Barrett when I was a teenager. Like really, really super interested. It was just so strange. It's like, how does this even happen? I mean, I could analyze one of those songs, but in some cases there's like 2 chords and it's kind of a shuffle rhythm, and what are you going to say about it? So, okay, so Nathan Gale writes, I've really enjoyed the analysis you did of the lyrics of some pop songs, such as Underground, Murder Mystery, etc. Have you considered doing videos focused on analyzing poetry? It would be great to get your recommendations and analysis of some contemporary poets. No, I haven't considered that, just because, I mean, this is a music channel, and there are channels devoted to poetry. There are wonderful resources on the web. There are people who are experts in this subject that can tell you way more interesting things about it than I can. I mean, there's actually a great website called Pen Sound that's run by the University of Pennsylvania. There's this wonderful American experimental poet, Charles Bernstein, who's conducted all kinds of really fascinating interviews with contemporary poets. Just go on to Pen Sound and listen to those interviews and all the resources that are available there. And that'll give you just an amazing overview of what's going on in contemporary poetry. But I don't feel any need to do that myself. Just, again, there's only so many hours in the day, and this is, I'm focusing on music. However, just as a point of, I suppose, biographical interest, when I was still living in Canada, which is up until when I was 22, I was very, very involved in the literary community there. And in fact, I was probably better known sort of in that regard than I was as a musician. And I had a publishing house devoted to contemporary experimental poetry, and most of my friends were poets at the time. So, and I also read voraciously. I was very, very interested in all kinds of developments in the contemporary poetry world. So I have a very long-standing fascination with poetry generally, and so it's a topic that I've thought about very, very deeply, and certainly I've read a great deal. So, but I mean, that's different than somebody who teaches poetry or whose main professional preoccupation is with poetry. So I can't make that claim for myself. So Nombre Apilado writes, can you analyze more rock songs, maybe by request? Nobody applies that kind of technical knowledge on mainstream music. I find it very refreshing and insightful, and it helps understand in a different way the effort and creativity of a musician. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to keep doing it. So the thing about analyzing by request, there's a slight problem there. First of all, I love hearing people's requests because I'm just curious to know what people are interested in hearing about, and I do take them into consideration. The only issue is the analysis videos take a really long time to do. And in the best of scenarios currently, with the schedule that I have, I can, maybe do one a month. And most of the time I don't manage that. So, so the thing is, if I'm going to do, let's say I do 10 analysis videos in a year, I'm going to focus on the pieces that, for one reason or another, are really asking me some hard questions as a musician, that are sort of preoccupying me, because that I think it's best if I focus on things that I find really fascinating and that I can talk about with some degree of passion, enthusiasm, and genuine curiosity. If it's somebody else's request, maybe that connects with that, and maybe it doesn't. But it's harder for me to fit that in, given that I only have so many videos I can do in a year. That being said, there are some names that do crop up again and again, and that does make an impact. So, for example, many people have requested a video about Henri Dutilleux, and I will be doing something about him for sure. Takumitsu is another one. That name keeps coming up all the time. So yes, it will eventually make a difference. I can't necessarily field all kinds of requests and make a video every week. I don't have the time to do that. But anyway, but the names that come up repeatedly, I take note of. So that's what I can say about that. So, New Sung Sales writes, I am what they call a musical dilettante, but to my understanding there are two primary styles or genres of music that commonly get assigned the label minimalism. There is on the one hand the work of Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and Terry Riley, and then the so-called holy minimalists such as Arvo Pärt, Sir John Tavener, or Henryk Górecki. Have you analyzed some of these artists' work? And if so, what are your thoughts or critiques of their styles and approaches? That's a hard question, because you're asking me to give an opinion on a very large group of very disparate creative artists. who actually have very little in common. Like, that's the thing about these labels, minimalism, new complexity, spectralism, is they're sort of convenient for like journalists, critics, and maybe audience goers to some degree, because they sort of seem to cut through the noise and reduce the chaos. And okay, there's these categories, and then you can sort of think in terms of the category. But when you look at the works really closely, it breaks down pretty fast. Like, everybody groups together Steve Reich and Philip Glass. They have very little in common, actually. Like, they're completely different artists. There's no reason why you should necessarily lump them together. They do have some points in common, yes, but they're very different. So I would tend to not think so much in terms of that, that kind of a label. That's the first thing. As to whether I would consider analyzing them, yes, I certainly would. I mean, I attended a performance of Einstein on the Beach in Paris a few years ago. It really struck me. I thought it was a masterpiece, just an incredibly powerful, inventive, creative vision. I'm very, very admirative of that work, and of works by many of the composers you mentioned. So, yes, I will be keeping all of them in mind. So, Oidis Franco writes, "Hello, Mr. Andreyev. Thank you for your work and this Q&A. Do you think there is a lack of interest from contemporary composers to record and produce their pieces for distribution in online and streaming platforms such as SoundCloud, Bandcamp, Spotify, and for publicity and marketing in a way to promote and produce their own concert, or even for spreading the music?" Well, there are some composers who take this very seriously and spend a lot of time actually on disseminating their own work through social media, and there are composers for whom it is not a priority at all. I had lunch the other day with a colleague who is not on any social media. He doesn't like it, and he prefers to work basically in isolation and be completely disconnected. And then, the only thing that matters for him really is writing the pieces is the most important thing, and then performances are important. But whether they're recorded, whether they end up on a CD, whether they end up on the internet, he doesn't really care all that much. So, it's a question of your priorities, I guess, where you want to spend your time. Personally, I think that dissemination and resonance of some kind through just having the possibility of the piece enter some kind of a larger cultural conversation, I think that's really important. I really feel that it's important for me anyway to at least attempt, I'm not saying I'm successful at this, but at least attempt to put my stuff out there and have people talk about it and listen to the reactions. And that doesn't mean I'm going to write differently based on the reactions. In fact, it doesn't mean that at all. But just to know that it's existing in the world, independently of me, is for myself very important. But the other side to that, though, is that takes a lot of time. It's you have to have a strategy. You have to think very carefully about how you're going to use these platforms, because it's not always obvious. If you want to use something like SoundCloud well and actually get followers, and then you have to put some time into it. And so for me, yes, it's very important. And you have to be willing to put the time in. And if you're going to do it, don't dabble in it. Do it really well. Become an expert. Really understand these platforms well. Understand how they work. Understand how you can get the most out of them. My own channel, I would be happy if it grew faster than it has been. I wouldn't call it a phenomenal success. I would say that it's doing pretty well. I'm happy for it to continue to do better. But there are certain things I'm not going to do differently. My videos tend to not involve a great deal of editing. They tend to be sort of fairly spontaneous, and they tend to be longer also. And I would get more views if I did shorter videos that were really tightly edited and that had animations and graphics and all that kind of stuff. But it's just, and I'm super happy for the people who do that. And I think there's a lot of folks doing great work in that direction, but it's not what I want to do personally. And if that means I have fewer subscribers or whatever, that's fine. You also have to try to set up your life in such a way that makes sense, and that results in an enjoyable life for you. So here I am in Switzerland. It's a beautiful day. So anyway, Coin Toaster writes, why do you think a rather small amount of pop musicians are interested in expanding the standard verse-chorus-verse formula and composing with less common, more complex chord progressions? Well, because you don't need to. You don't need 4,000 chords to make a pop song. The point of a pop song is to take something that's familiar, that's just familiar currency. Everybody is familiar with. Everyone can understand it. Everyone can sort of pick it up and sort of remember the tune. And if you can play a couple of chords on a guitar, you can probably bang out some kind of half decent rendition of it. That's the point. The point is not necessarily to push the boundaries of the musical art, so to speak. I would say it's to come up with some kind of an authentic individual voice, something that matches the particular cadences of your speaking or singing style, and that's probably more important than engaging in technical speculation, I would say. So there's no reason to, there's no incentive to, and when the music gets overly samey, when it's just you're just hearing microscopic variations on the same 2 or 3 ideas over and over and over again with minimal change, and it's getting a bit boring, then that's usually when you have some new style that emerges and sort of there's a counter reaction and something. It's like New Wave. When New Wave happened, it was like it was completely refreshing. That sort of thing. So that's very often how new styles are born. Is that an old style gets worn out, it gets overly cliched, it's been explored, and it's time to move on to something else. But pop music isn't really the natural province for just sort of unfettered experimentation or harmonic sophistication necessarily. It can be, but when that does happen, it tends to be a little bit more on the margins. So when you reduce the ease of understanding and the ease of accessibility beyond a certain point, then to a certain degree it stops functioning as pop music. It becomes something else, or it becomes kind of it starts to enter a gray zone somehow. So okay, I'll do 1 or 2 more and then I'm going to stop, because I'm going to start getting, well, the sun's in my eyes and I'm getting less coherent. Okay, so Damien Oneto writes, do you think total serialism was left off too early? I get the sense it wasn't a bad approach, but it was used too rawly and lacked the sophistication needed to reach higher strands of musicality. Well, first of all, it isn't as though you can say that there's some kind of a homogeneous body of techniques that constitutes what total serialism is. Total serialism, sort of like New Complexity or like minimalism, it reflects an attitude and a general approach more than it reflects necessarily a specific body of techniques. So I think what you can say is sometimes these attitudes, which usually are connected with a particular cultural historical moment that doesn't last forever. It's like we're not forever stuck in 1945, right? So that there's no reason to write sort of serial pieces in 2019 in the same manner as it would have been approached at that time, because it's a completely different period. There's different preoccupations. People are trying to do different things now. If you happen to be interested in that style and furthering it, then great. If there's new things to be said in it, and if there's aspects of it that are unexplored, and if it really resonates with you, then fantastic. It may not be a preoccupation for the majority of musicians. That doesn't necessarily matter. It doesn't mean that it's valueless or that it's exhausted as an idea. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah, I mean, total serialism. In terms of some of the works that were done, I would say that the individual works that are associated with that approach, in many cases, offer extremely interesting perspectives. And there's all kinds of works like that. And it doesn't mean that you need to literally take the techniques that were used in those particular pieces and use them to write new pieces. But maybe it means that if you analyze them closely and think carefully about how they were put together, then maybe there's aspects about those pieces that can maybe influence you to look a little bit farther in a particular direction, or to abstract out solutions that you could not just sort of lift from those pieces, but actually digest properly in such a way that they become almost like invisible components of your own style. That's what I would say about it. So, okay, so I'll do 1 more, and then that's going to be it. Are there any big new composers today, like Arnold Schoenberg or Igor Stravinsky or Wagner or Beethoven? It seems the culture has run dry, so to speak. Honest question, and one which probably a lot of people have lurking in their minds somewhere. I hope you don't take offense. Maybe you yourself will be the next giant. Okay, well, what's the difference between 2019 and 1850? Well, there's many, many, many differences, obviously. One of them, though, is that there are many more people who are claiming to be composers today than would have been the case 170 years ago. So, every university in every country is turning out doctoral students in composition, practically, that most of whom have few prospects. It has to be said, just from a purely statistical point of view, most of them probably won't end up having long-term careers as composers. It's a statistical reality. That's not necessarily a reflection on the talent of individual musicians. It's just that's how it tends to go. Anyway, so there's a lot of people. The barrier for entering a career as a composer is probably lower now than it has been at other times in history. Also, you don't have to have a degree of any kind to lay claim to being a composer. You just have to write music, put it online, put it on SoundCloud, and there you go. You've got some pieces. Maybe they're not very good pieces, but it's like you can still put them out there and sort of engage with other people who are doing the same thing. So there's a kind of a cacophony of voices all competing for attention. Whereas in the past, this situation was controlled a lot more tightly by publishers, by performers, that's true to some degree today as well. It's just that the publishers and agents and things like that have actually quite a lot less power than they used to in that respect. And that's partly because of just the total decentralizing of culture that's resulted from the internet. Suddenly the entry barrier is way lower. Anybody can sort of put their stuff out there. It's much cheaper. It's much easier than it used to be. You don't have to have your scores professionally engraved. You can get Sibelius or something, or you can get a free music notation software and do it yourself, at no cost. So that's resulted, I think, in a kind of a dilution of the sort of the field of composers who are working today and who are active. That doesn't mean that there aren't some extremely brilliant careers, like people who are just writing amazing works, getting them played all over the world and having a real impact. There are certainly figures like that. You might be slightly less likely to have heard of them simply because there's a lot of people writing music. And the way people listen to music is very different too. I mean, if you go on the internet, you can listen to a billion compositions for free at any time. That didn't used to be the case. So the way that people actually go about listening has also resulted in an extreme fragmentation of the music world. So it doesn't have to do so much with, it's not like humanity has become less talented, or like people are writing less good works necessarily, or that we don't have the sort of great musicians anymore. It's just that the musical world has become fragmented. It's sort of fragmented down into audiences that are really specialized. Also, like on the one hand, you're gonna have audiences that are really into Baroque opera, people who are into contemporary chamber opera. It's like even something like opera itself, which is already sort of a subgenre of classical music, has all these subgenres within it, and then audiences that are into that particular thing, and not to mention all of the thousands of different subcategories of different types of pop music, electronic music, rap, etc. So, yeah, so there's a much wider cultural offering on display. It's international, it's global. People are listening to way more music than ever before in history, but people's attention spans are a little bit shorter, and there's you might listen to something for a couple of minutes, decide it's not for you, and then move on to the next thing. It's not comparable to what the situation would have been in the 1850s. So what does all of this mean? I don't think we know yet. It's too soon. It's too radical a shift. Maybe there will be a counter push back, in the opposite direction. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to play out. But there's no question that there's been a radical change in the way music is disseminated and listened to, and that this also has a profound effect on composers and listeners. So that's what I can say about that. So I'm going to go out now and enjoy this beautiful day, and I will see you soon. If you like this channel, support it. Your help allows me to keep on making high-quality music education videos available to anyone around the world who wants to watch them at any time for free. Check out the rewards for varying levels of support at www.patreon.com/SamuelAndreyev. Thanks for watching.